Imagine standing in the heart of Edinburgh, looking up at the castle, feeling safe because stone surrounds you. Now picture what sits just below that rock. Not a garden, not a railway, a dark man-made lock that became the city's filth pit. Waste, sewage, rot. A barrier meant to stop enemies, and a threat that never left. People lived pressed against that edge for generations, knowing the city could not breathe outward, only upward, only tighter. This video is not just about looking at old images. It is about stepping into them. I am using modern AI tools to animate historic paintings, maps, and engravings so we can move through old Edinburgh, shift perspective, and change camera angles. Not to pretend we have perfect reconstruction, but to feel the shape of the city and the pressure it put on the people inside it. And if you stay with me until the end, I will bring you back to the same places today. You will see what was erased, what survived, and what still hides in plain sight. We start earlier than most people ever do. We start at a drawing that takes us back to around the mid-1400s, long before the wide streets and planned expansion, long before the elegant new town. This is not a precise blueprint, but it captures the truth of the city at that time. Edinburgh is not spread out, it is stretched. The town clings to a narrow ridge of land, like a line of life drawn across a spine of rock. The castle sits at the highest point, planted into the stone itself. Everything else runs downhill from there. Houses, workshops, churches, lanes, all stacked along the same narrow route. And here is the part that matters. There is very little room to grow. On both sides of the ridge, the ground drops steeply. The slopes and valleys are not gentle, they are limits. That single fact shapes Edinburgh for centuries. It forces the city into a kind of long pressure. As the population grows, the city cannot easily push outward, so it compresses, it crowds, it rises. When you look at Edinburgh like this, you can almost predict the future. You can see what will happen when too many lives are squeezed into too little space. Now we move forward, the mid-1600s. The view is from the south. The city is still pinned along the ridge. The old town holds the high ground, dense and shadowed. Most life is compressed into a thin strip. Beyond the edge of the buildings, the world opens up quickly. Fields, slopes, open ground. Very little built beyond the city line. Edinburgh has not spread outward yet. It builds upward instead. If you lived here, the city would feel like walls. Not only stone walls, but the feeling of being boxed in by terrain, by defense, by tradition, by the simple lack of space. You would feel it in the streets, in the narrow closes, in the way sound echoes, in the way light disappears between tall tenements, in the way crowds press forward because there is nowhere else to go. And when you stand above it all, your eye always returns to one place, the castle. It is worth slowing down here, because Edinburgh Castle is more than a landmark. For centuries, it is the center of power. It is defined by position. It sits high above the city, built into the rock. From outside, it is meant to be seen from a distance. Solid, elevated, hard to approach. It looks less like a building placed on land, and more like land made into a building. Whoever controlled this rock controlled the city below it. Edinburgh Castle took shape as a royal fortress in the 11th century, likely under Malcolm III, built to command the rock and defend the settlement below. For centuries, this place sat at the center of Scotland's political and military struggle. It was besieged, damaged, rebuilt, and fought over again and again. By the time we reach the 1700s, the castle is already hundreds of years old. But here is something we forget when we talk about fortresses. Most days inside a fortress are not heroic. They are repetitive, they are routine. For many of the people who lived and worked here, the castle meant guard duty, maintenance, drills, waiting, and long stretches where nothing happened. Important history happened here, yes, but daily life was often dull. A fortress can be the center of a nation's story and still feel like a slow place to live. Now we move inside the walls, and the perspective shifts. The grand height falls away. The castle becomes rooms, courtyards, enclosed spaces. It becomes a working environment, a lived place, a space where people exercised power from within. And there is a small detail that reminds us how old these images are. If the Union flag looks slightly wrong, you are seeing it correctly. This is what it looked like before Ireland was represented, when the Union reflected only England and Scotland. We will come back to the castle later to see how it looks today, but for now, we move away from the rock. We follow the city downhill along the ridge, toward the other end of its spine, because Edinburgh is shaped by two anchors, two poles of power, one military, one royal and ceremonial. This is the Palace of Holyrood House. The site begins as a royal abbey in the 12th century, founded under King David I. Over time, it grows into Scotland's main royal residence in the city. By the 1600s and beyond, this is where kings and queens stay when they are in Edinburgh. By the 1700s, it remains the official royal residence in Scotland, though it is used far less than it once was after the Union of Parliament. In 1707 shifts real power south to London. Standing here feels different from standing at the castle. The castle is a fist. Holyrood is a hand. Everything here feels flatter, more open, less defensive. This is not a last line of defense. It is a place of court life, ceremony, governance, and negotiation, set at the edge of city and countryside. There once was a gateway here as part of the palace precinct, built in the early 1600s as a formal entrance. That original gatehouse was demolished in 1753. Only fragments survive, woven into buildings around the Abbey courthouse today. It is strange to think how many people pass through a point like this, a threshold between the city and the royal world, when now it is easy to walk past without realizing what stood here. Holyrood Abbey, built as an Augustinian monastery and religious center, closely tied to the royal court, served for centuries as a place of worship, burial, and ceremony. But by the late 1700s, it was no longer a functioning church. After the Reformation, it fell into disuse. By the 18th century, it stood open to the sky, slowly breaking apart beside the palace. This contrast matters. The castle dominates the city from above. Holyrood sits at the end of the ridge like an open door. One place was built to resist. The other was built to host. And between them, stretched along the spine, is the Old Town, dense and crowded, carrying the weight of centuries. Now we move deeper into that Old Town world. We shift to a late 17th century north-facing view of Edinburgh. The city is stretched along its ridge, with the castle anchoring the skyline. From this angle, you see how tightly packed the Old Town is, and how abruptly the land drops away. And here you notice something unusual. The city seems to almost meet the water at the foot of the castle. That water is the Norloch. It was not natural. It was deliberately created in the 15th century by damming the valley, turning the north side of Edinburgh into a defensive barrier beneath the castle. If you want to understand why Edinburgh stayed trapped on its ridge, you need to understand what this lock meant. At first, it is defense, a moated void at the base of the rock, a wet obstacle that makes approach harder, a line that says, "Do not come this way." But then centuries pass, the city grows, the pressure increases, and the lock takes on a second role that is far less noble. It becomes the dumping ground. As the Old Town becomes more crowded, waste flows downhill. Household refuse, sewage, detritus, all thrown toward the water. Over time, the lock turns from barrier into problem. In some accounts, it also becomes a place of grim display, moments of punishment or spectacle meant to be seen from above, proof that authority could reach into public life in ugly ways. Imagine living on the ridge and looking down. The castle above you, the cramped streets around you, and below, a body of water that is turned into something you do not want to smell, do not want to touch, do not want to think about. By the 1700s, the Norloch is no longer simply a lock. It is a sign of a city that has outgrown its own defenses. And then comes the turning point. Beginning in the 1760s, the Norloch is gradually drained and filled in to make room for a project that changes Edinburgh forever. The North Bridge, stretching across the former valley to link the Old Town with new ground beyond it. In images from this period, you can see the bridge taking shape, and it is more than engineering. It is a declaration. Edinburgh is no longer turning inward for defense. It is turning outward for growth. Think about what that means. A city that once created an artificial lock when it needed protection, later decides to erase that same lock when it needs space. It is the same landscape, reshaped by different fears and different ambitions. And this is where the story begins to accelerate. Because once you create a bridge, you do not just connect 2 points. You change the direction of an entire city. Before we go further, I want to pause on a place that had already watched Edinburgh change again and again. St. Giles Cathedral in the late 1700s. By this point, it is far more than a church. It is a place where sermons can spark unrest, where political ideas take shape, where the city gathers not only for faith but for tension. What is striking is how closely everyday life presses against it. Homes and shops sit tight to the walls. People move past as part of routine. St. Giles is not set apart like a monument. It stands inside the flow of the city, absorbing noise, arguments, commerce, and the rhythms of daily survival. Now look at the statue in front of it in these views. It depicts King Charles II, restored to the throne after years of civil war, placed here as a public signal that royal authority has returned. By the late 1700s, the statue has already stood for well over a century. This is the kind of detail that tells you how power works. It wants to be seen. It wants to be placed in the center of the street, not hidden in a courtyard. It wants the city to move around it, and now we keep walking along the ridge. The Royal Mile, more commonly known then as the High Street, is the main artery of the Old Town. It runs downhill from the castle to Holyrood, linking the two seats of power. This is not just a road, it is the city's spine. If you lived in Edinburgh, this corridor would shape your days, your work, your errands, your encounters, your fears. On this spine stands the Tron Kirk. The tower feels familiar, but the details are not identical to today. Over centuries, it has been repaired, altered, simplified. Built in the 17th century, the Tron Kirk is not just a church, it is a marker of civic life at one of the busiest crossroads in the city. Imagine standing here in the 1700s. You would not hear quiet. You would hear trade, wheels, footsteps, voices calling, arguments rising, the constant scrape of life crammed into narrow space. This stretch of street is loud and crowded. People move between markets, courts, and churches. Everything important seems to pass in front of you. The Tron watches it all, not from a distance, but from the center of the press. Now, I want to shift your view again, because in Edinburgh, where you stand changes what the city feels like. We look toward the south side of the castle. Here, the rock drops sharply into open ground. From this angle, the city feels compact and defensive. Buildings packed behind the fortress, little room to spread. Then we turn west. The land opens. The slopes soften. And suddenly, Edinburgh feels less like a fortress and more like a city on the edge of expansion. Same castle, different viewpoint, different story. Now we come to a view dated 1746. And the most interesting thing is not the date. Look at the foreground. People are playing golf beneath the castle. It is such a small detail, almost easy to miss, but it changes the mood. Even with the fortress looming overhead, even with centuries of conflict behind it, people still make time to play. It reminds you that cities are not only made of politics and war, they are made of afternoons, rivalries, jokes, habits, and the stubborn desire to enjoy a patch of open ground when you can. Now we move to another building that stands out in the city's landscape. Harriet's Hospital, seen from the south. Despite the name, it is not a hospital in the modern sense. It is founded in the 17th century as a charitable school, created to educate and support children from poorer families. Its scale and symmetry are not accidental. This building is a statement. It says that learning and discipline matter, that the city wants to be seen as more than walls and punishment. Nearby, the Royal Infirmary tells a different story. By the mid-17th century, it becomes a center for treating the sick and injured and for teaching a more scientific approach to healthcare. Compared to Harriet's, it feels more controlled, more formal. It reflects a growing belief that illness can be studied, managed, improved through order, education and medicine. Two signals of a city beginning to look forward, even while its streets remain medieval in shape. Now we arrive at a place that marks the boundary of the old world. The Netherbow Port, just before it is taken down in 1764. For centuries, this gate marks the eastern edge of the Old Town. It funnels everyone entering or leaving through a single, narrow point. Standing here, you are looking at a city that lived behind walls for hundreds of years. A city that had to control movement, monitor entry, and defend itself not only from armies, but from disorder. And then the gate comes down. A structure that once embodied medieval Edinburgh becomes an obstruction to a city that is changing. When the Netherbow Port is removed, it is not just demolition. It is a psychological shift, a sign that the city is ready to stop thinking of itself as a sealed container. But do not imagine that life inside the Old Town becomes gentle overnight. Not when authority still sits in the middle of the street. Now we stop at the old toll booth, standing right on the high street. A toll booth is the civic heart of a Scottish burgh. Part town hall, part courthouse, part prison, often all at once. A building everyone would know, and many would fear. From outside, it looks solid and unavoidable, planted in the flow of daily life, so you cannot forget that law and punishment are never far away. And when you step inside, the mood changes immediately. The street noise fades. The air feels heavier. This is not a ceremonial space. It is confinement, holding cells, uncertainty, debtors, criminals, political prisoners, cramped conditions, harsh routines. The city carries on outside, traders calling, carts rolling, people laughing, people shouting, and inside, people wait in the dark, wondering what comes next. This contrast is the true texture of Old Edinburgh, beauty and oppression in the same stone, commerce and confinement in the same day, faith and fear on the same street. Now I want to bring you back to the high street one more time, because it is easy to describe buildings and forget what the street itself meant. In late 18th century views, the Royal Mile already feels like the backbone of Edinburgh. Tall tenements packed tightly together, carts and horses pushing through the center, people gathering, trading, arguing, living almost on top of one another. This was not just a road you used, it was a corridor you endured. If you lived here, the city would not feel spacious. It would feel like constant contact, not always hostile, but always close. The press of bodies, the lack of privacy, the way your life would be visible, audible, unavoidable. The way the city forces you into each other. And that is why the projects of the later 18th century matter so much. The draining of the Norloch, the building of the North Bridge, the push toward the new town. These are not only architectural changes, they are an escape valve. Now we are ready to jump forward, because the most haunting part of this story is not what disappeared. It is what remained. Since the 1700s, Edinburgh Castle has been rebuilt and reshaped, leaving it looking different from earlier centuries. Today, it survives as Scotland's most powerful historic symbol, but there are places inside it where the past still feels physically present. Courtyards, where the layout and surrounding stone remain close to what they were, repaired rather than completely remade. And when you step there, you can almost feel the older city still watching. Holyrood Palace survives as Scotland's official royal residence. It has been refurbished over time, but more gently than the castle. It remains a lived royal space, still used by the British royal family when they are in Scotland. Beside it, the abbey stands in ruin, open to the sky, a reminder of how institutions fade even when stones remain. St. Giles Cathedral has been altered and restored many times as ideas about worship and the city changed. Yet, it remains a central church and one of the strongest links to the Old Town. St. Cuthbert's, sitting beneath the castle, has been rebuilt and expanded through the centuries, adapting as the city around it transformed. It still sits quietly in the shadow of the rock and the Norloch, the feature that once defined the north side of the Old Town. The man-made defense that became a putrid burden. It was drained over time, and by the early 19th century, it was gone. In its place came Prince's Street Gardens, green space where stagnant water once sat. The valley that once helped defend the city became a place people stroll through, taking photos, drinking coffee, watching the seasons change under the same castle that once watched prisoners and soldiers. That transformation is almost impossible to hold in your mind until you stand there. The Royal Infirmary expanded and modernized as medicine advanced, and eventually moved away as the city outgrew the old site. The area remains tied to learning and teaching, much of it now part of the University of Edinburgh, still carrying the idea that knowledge is one of the city's great engines. Harriet's Hospital continued its role as a charitable school, adapting with changing ideas of education. Today it survives as George Heriot School, still using the same buildings for learning. The Tron Kirk changed dramatically. Over time, the interior was stripped out and rebuilt more than once. And today only the tower and outer shell remain. Along a street once packed wall to wall, the Kirk now stands as a rare open break in the dense spine of the Royal Mile. And the High Street itself, the climb toward the castle, the slope, the sense of direction, those have not changed, even if almost everything built along it has. Here is what I want you to take from this. Edinburgh is not a city that replaced itself in one clean sweep. It is a city made of layers, each generation built on what was already there, leaving traces pressed together, sometimes beautifully, sometimes brutally. The past is not behind glass here. It is under your feet, beside your shoulder, embedded in the angles of streets and the weight of stone. So, when you visit, do not only look up at the castle and think of battles. Look down at the ground and remember what the city once did to survive. How it trapped itself for
The
defense,
centuries of
how it
crowding
crowded itself for
finally give
centuries,
way to the
how it
expansive
finally
vision
opened
of the
outward when
new
it could.
town.
And then ask yourself this: if you had lived here when the city was pinned to the ridge, when the lock below turned foul, when gates controlled your movement, when prisons sat in the middle of your daily route, would you have felt proud or would you have felt trapped? Maybe both. Thanks for watching. If you want to see another city brought back to life in the same way, tell me in the comments which place you want to step into next. And if you enjoyed this journey through Old Edinburgh, stay with the channel. The past is closer than you think.